Exercising Dominion. That's the title I have chosen for tonight's lesson. And this is something that when I start talking about it, you'll say, oh, he's talked about that a lot. And I have in different sermons and Bible class lessons, but I don't know that I've ever talked about this dichotomy of spirit and flesh in one singular lesson. Perhaps I have, but that's where we're going with this tonight. If you go to Genesis chapter 1, we'll get started talking about these things. Incidentally, if you have a New International Version, I'm not against the New International Version, but in the King James or in the New American Standard, you'll see flesh and you'll see spirit. These two concepts juxtaposed against one another. But in the New International Version, you don't see flesh, you see sinful nature. Now the reason they translated that sinful nature, and technically they didn't translate it, they expounded on it with what they thought it meant, and I disagree with what they think it means. The Greek word is actually flesh. And I like to be given the Greek, its English translation or English equivalent, whenever that's possible. And it's very possible to do that because all the other translations almost have done that. So if you've got a New International Version, you don't have to throw it away. Just be advised, when you see the words sinful nature, it's always actually flesh. And it helps me a great deal to understand much more about myself than the idea of sinful nature. And here's where we're going to get started with that in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Because we read in chapter 1, of course this is all the account of the creation, but it says in verse 26, then God said, Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over it. Rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky, over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, in short, this is God telling humanity, I've created this earth, this environment for you. I want you to take charge of it. I want you to use it. Just like if you brought someone to a home that you've prepared for them, you'd say, go on in there, use that stove, use that refrigerator, use that washing machine. Everything that's in there, we want you to use it. Sleep in the bed, sit on the couch, watch the TV. If you furnish that place, why did you furnish it? You furnished it because you want the inhabitants to use it, to enjoy it, and to reflect back and say, wow, that guy that gave us this house, they're just wonderful. Look at all the things we get to enjoy because of what they've given to us. That's what God is giving us the creation for, so that we might use it, dominate it, if you will. And I hesitate to use the word dominate because it tends to have a negative connotation. But there's nothing negative about this. This is all very positive. God says, this is for you, use it. Now, we don't want to escape the fact that we as human beings are part of the creation. And we get into this in chapter 2. Look at verse 7. Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So there was man who was made of the dust. The dust is of the earth. It is of this world. It is of the creation. But what God breathed into that dirt was not of the creation. What God breathed into that dirt was of Himself. And yet, you and I are still beings who are connected to this creation by our physical bodies. They're made of dirt. When we die, the body goes back to the dirt. But just as Solomon said, where does the spirit go? Spirit goes back to God who gave it. So we have this dichotomy in ourselves. I'm a person of flesh. My flesh desires, admires, wants, lusts after, if you will, the things of this world, this earth. But my spirit is constantly in conflict Because I know that there are higher, if you will, and better things than just the things of the earth. Now, we use the term higher, but that's a legitimate reality. When we talk about someone of low character, have you ever used that phraseology, used that terminology? What has that person done to make you see them as being of low character? Is it because of their spiritual attributes, or is it because of their worldly attributes? Is it because they pursued things of the Spirit, or do they pursue things of the world? When we see people who are pursuing actively the things of the world, we see them as low people. We don't might perhaps like that. I'm not talking about being judgmental. I'm just saying that's the way we look at it. Some things are higher. Well, what things are higher? Drinking, drugs, illegitimate sex, cursing. We know those things aren't higher. Those things are lower, vulgar, profane. Now, vulgar and profane don't necessarily mean bad, but when you look at them in the context of some things that are vulgar and profane, they're bad. They are low. There is the high, there is the low. There are the things that are of the world, and there are the things that are of God. You and I are of the flesh, living in this world, but we have a spirit that has come from God. And what God says to us, I want you to dominate this world. And in dominating this world, we find out we have to dominate ourselves. Make sense? Makes perfect sense to me the more I think about it. John the Apostle addressed this, because this isn't something that's just old and pertains back there. This comes right up through every age of humanity, and every hour of our lives we have this struggle within us, the spirit against the flesh. And John addressed this in 1 John chapter 2, where he talked about all that's in the world. If you want to go there, this will sort of give us another perspective. And when you go to 1 John chapter 2, put a marker there, because my plan is, Lord willing, to come back to 1 John and wrap this lesson up. But in 1 John chapter 2, John says this in verse 15. Do not love the world. And in this context, we're talking about the creation. Do not love the world. Do not love the things of the creation, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Wow. Just let that sink in for a minute. If we have fallen in love with the world, the love of the Father is not in us. What did God tell us to do in the beginning? He said, dominate the world. He didn't say fall in love with it. He said, dominate it, use it, subdue it. Make the creation serve you. If we do not make the creation serve us, we will wind up serving the creation. And that's particularly and intimately true in our own being. If I do not dominate my flesh, what will my flesh do? My flesh will dominate me. And we see people every day whose lives have been dominated by their flesh. They allow it to happen. Because you have power over your flesh. I have power over my flesh. God has given us that, and it's up to us to exercise it. So it says, don't love the world, nor the things in the world. All that's in the world, he says in verse 16, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, that is of the world. The world's passing away, and also its lusts. But the one who does the will of God lives forever. There's that dichotomy. Lust of the flesh, we understand that. Lust of the eyes, we understand that. Boastful pride of life, I think we understand that as well, but the first two seem very closely related to each other. And the boastful pride of life is almost like it's off to itself. But it's still part of the flesh, part of this world. When we are young, here is our tendency, and I see this tendency, I saw it in myself, I saw it in our own children. Perhaps some of you have seen it in your children. I'm going to do it myself. Why do we think like that? Well, here's part of the deal, and there's some psychology involved. When you're little, you don't know anything, and you kind of know you don't know anything, and so you really want to know something, and as soon as you start to learn things, the least little bit of knowledge makes you feel like, now I know everything. And since I believe I know everything, I'm going to demand to do everything by myself. Now, with this idea of having dominion, let me throw a couple of illustrations out here and see if this makes sense. Take a little boy that wants to learn how to fish. Any of you young boys want to learn how to fish? Any of you old guys remember when you were young and you wanted to learn how to fish? Now, you can provide that young man the best, most elite and expensive fishing equipment, and then just put him in amongst that stuff and say, go to it, son. And if you do that, what will you probably wind up with if you're talking about a young boy 10, 12 years old? If he has no experience with that stuff, you're probably going to wind up with a bunch of broken fishing tackle that doesn't work anymore and a frustrated, angry, upset young boy. That's probably what's going to happen. Because he does not know how to have dominion over that fishing gear, and if he doesn't learn how to have dominion over the gear, he's never going to have a dominion in fishing, and so he's going to wind up being frustrated and upset. But if you take that young man and put him with an experienced fisherman, that fisherman can say, here son, here's how to use a fishing rod. Here's how to feed the line onto the spool, and here's the size of line you need to use if you want to catch this kind of fish, and here's how to tie the knot for the hook so the hook doesn't come off. Now, you've got to keep in mind at the same time, you've got to have a young man who is willing to deny his own pride, and instead of saying, I do it myself, he'll say, okay, you show me how this is done. And how many of us at one point or another haven't said, I'm going to do it myself? When really what we needed was to say, would you please show me how this is done? Now God comes to us, He gives us the creation, and He says, I want you to have dominion. And for us, the smart thing to do is, God, how can I have dominion? What can I do? What's the best way for me to relate to all these things that you've provided me? And especially, what's the best way to relate to these other people whom you have created in your image? And we need a lot of help with that, not just because we are struggling with the flesh, but because they are also struggling with the flesh. You see what the potential is for a mess? Everything was fine in the garden until what happened? Eve gave way to the lust of the flesh. She gave way to the lust of the eyes. She gave way to the boastful pride of life, because those are all the three things, if you look at Genesis chapter 3, that the devil used against her. And when she gave in to those things, she ate of the forbidden fruit, she gave it to Adam. And instead of Adam standing up for what was right, he gave in to the flesh as well. And sin entered into the world and the knowledge of sin. And we've been wrestling with that ever since. So you got that little boy. He wants to learn how to fish. And the fisherman says, here's how you do it. And he says, okay, I'm going to do it that way. What do you think you're going to wind up with as time goes on? Don't you think you wind up with a young man who knows how to fish? And as he applies what he has learned, he gains his own experience, he gains his own proficiency. And before long, what's that young man able to do? Well, he's able to pull somebody else. Hey, here's how you fish. And that young man himself might be frustrated because he's looking around down at the lake or down at the river, and he's seeing all these people who aren't doing it right. He's saying, hey, can I help you? And some of them will say, yeah, I need some help with this. Just like Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. What was Philip's question? Hey, what are you doing up there? Well, I'm reading from the prophet Isaiah. Do you understand what you're reading? Well, how can I understand this unless somebody would guide me? What would have happened that day if the Ethiopian eunuch had listened to his flesh, his pride of life, and said, I'll do it myself. Got me some commentaries up here. I'm going to be just fine. Go on. But he didn't do that. He humbled himself and he said, I need some help. Philip came up there. By the way, who sent Philip? Spirit of God sent Philip. Because he knew there was an opening there. That's what we need to provide the Lord. Isn't it just outstanding that God has the power and has used His power to speak this universe into existence for our benefit, give it to us, turn it over to us, and then say, now here, I'd like to show you how to use this creation. Would you allow me to do that? And we can say to the God of heaven, yes, I give you permission to show me how it's done. He comes down with us, among us, along our side, shows us how it's done. At the same time, we have the ability, we have the freedom, if you will, to say, no thanks, I'm going to do it myself. Now, when we say no thanks to God, what is it that's guiding us? Is it the Spirit that God spoke into us, or is it the flesh that is of this world? I think you know the answer to that. That hasn't changed since the Garden of Eden. It's still the same. I'm still a creature of flesh. You're still a creature of flesh. But thank God we're also creatures of spirit. And we have the power, we have the freedom to listen to God so we can learn how to do it right. Why do you think He provided us all of the things in this world that give pleasure in the first place? Not for 1 second do I believe God did that to tease us or to punish us. I believe He provided everything in this world that gives pleasure so that we might have pleasure from it. Just like James said, every good gift, every perfect gift, where does it come from? Father of lights, with whom there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Everything that's good in this world, God has provided. And if you'll stop and think about it, what legitimate sensual pleasure does God deny humanity? Really not a single one. Now, if you're talking about the excitement of stealing a watermelon, okay. He included that in the commandments twice. Thou shalt not steal, and also thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's watermelon. Okay, that's the redneck version, but it's in there. It's in there in principle. It's like they said on the Pirates of the Caribbean. Well, they're more like guidelines anyway. Yeah. But it's all there. And it's all there because the flesh and the spirit battle is always going on. And you and I have the freedom, we have the power to say to God, no, or say to God, yes. Come and help me. Come and show me. And if we give ourselves over to the Lord, every good thing of this earth becomes ours. Now, not in the way that slop becomes the property of a hog, and I bring this up for good reason. Have you ever seen one enjoying a good meal? How can I put this? In a gross and vile way. And you see them eating, and it's like, oh, you're just watching them eat. It's just a turnoff. I don't think I want to have anything to eat now. I was hungry until I saw this person eat. Oh, man. That's the way it is when people try to indulge in the good that God has provided in the way that God has said, oh, don't do it that way. And people are doing that all the time. When Paul wrote about meat, he said, I'm convinced that everything that God's given is good, if it's accepted with thanksgiving. Everything God has given with good. In marriage, there's place for romance and intimacy, but it's in marriage. And somebody might say, well, yeah, Marty, but not everybody gets to enjoy all of those things. And that's absolutely true. A lot of people are born into poverty. People are born in parts of the world where they're raised with hatred and violence and they're insecure all their lives. But why in the world would we think that God sent His Son into this earth except to provide a means for us to get out of this place? Because at best, and we are probably the people who are enjoying this world at its best, if you stop and think about the rest of the population of the planet. At best, it's going to be, like Job said, a few days and fraught with trouble. That's what Job said. And I know not everything that Job said should be taken face value, but when you look across the world at the plight of man, that's pretty much the way it is. Is any one of us immune to sickness? Is any one of us immune to injury? Is any one of us immune to heartache and struggle? Not a single one, because we are all people of flesh. And it would even seem that the more we pursue the things of the Spirit, the more we struggle in this world. Like it was with Lot. Peter talked about Lot, who lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and said his righteous soul was, as the King James puts it, vexed as he beheld day after day the lawless behavior of the people around him. And that's what happens to us as well in this world. But at the same time, do you remember seeing, those of you who were here this morning, the change in the faces of those little children? They started out in abject poverty and it was just blankness on their faces. And then somebody showed them some love. Somebody fed them. Somebody cleaned them up. Somebody put them in some clean clothes and hugged them and gave them a place to go to school and a place to sleep and other children to be with who were being taken care of. And everything changes. It's not that they had all that material stuff. It's that somehow their present ability to have dominion in a godly fashion over that material stuff gave them hope. And that's what we have in Christ. We have it in Christ because, well, as the Hebrew writer put it in Hebrews chapter 2, find my marks here. And I got to confess to you, like so many other lessons, I'm passing up a lot of stuff I thought to say tonight. But at any rate, I hope this is kind of coming together in some form or fashion. Hebrews chapter 2, this is what the Hebrew writer said. So we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, for whom all are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he's not ashamed to call them brethren. Then you drop down to verse 14. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. Why did Jesus come in the flesh? He came in the flesh for one reason, because we are in the flesh, and he came in the flesh to relate to us, but he also came in the flesh, as this text says, and as chapter 10 also says, he came in the flesh to die. If you look at chapter 10 of Hebrews, let's see here. Verse 4. Hebrews 10:4. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you've not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come, in the scroll of the book it's written of me, to do your will, O God. And what was God's will? God's will was for Christ to live sinlessly among us, and then to sacrifice that flesh, that body, that is spoken of in another place as the veil of His flesh. Remember what the veil was? The veil separated between us and the most holy place. That's what Jesus' body was. It was a separation between us and the most holy place of God. And when His veil, His body was sacrificed, through His flesh, we have access to the Father. Because our flesh, we weren't having dominion the way we needed to have dominion. And so Jesus came in the flesh. He had perfect dominion over His flesh, even though He was tempted like we were. And through His sacrifice, we now have freedom. And with that idea of freedom, go back to John chapter 6. And when you find John 6, then just a couple of pages over, get John chapter 8. And compare what Jesus says here in light of this dichotomy of flesh and spirit. And when I use that word dichotomy, that's kind of a big fancy sounding word. It just means distinct separation between two things. You got Coke and you got Pepsi. And I used to think, no big deal, it's pop. And then you get somebody who's a diehard Coke fan and you offer them a Pepsi. You know, there was a restaurant near where I grew up called the Mountaineer. It was a great place to eat, but it was shut down because somebody sued them. They ordered a Coke out of Pepsi, and they sued them because they gave them a Pepsi instead of a Coke. No joke. No joke. See, this is when I think judges ought to have the freedom to just shoot people right there in the courtroom. They've got laws against that too. But yeah, trap door, maybe that'd be better with crocodiles underneath. Anyway, I got a mean streak in me. It's the flesh. That's what it is. It's the flesh. The Spirit's trying to dominate, but it's the flesh. Well, what Jesus says here in John 6 is this. Verse 63, it's the Spirit who gives life. Do you remember hearing this quoted in a sermon or a Bible class before? Well, I hope so, because I feel like I've used this 100 times. It's the Spirit who gives life. The flesh does what? It profits nothing. The flesh profits nothing. I can testify. Do you see my hair? You can say no. It's okay. What happened to it, Marty? You know, I used to have a lot of beautiful hair when I was younger. I'm not younger anymore. And when you get older, and I'm not that old, it goes away. And even if you keep it till you die, you're still going to be dead. I've just been thinking in the last couple of weeks about how difficult the curl is becoming. And I'm not talking about the curl in my hair. I'm talking about that little curl you do when you get into your car and you kind of curl yourself up and you do this. Because I never used to think about it. I'd open the door and I'd get in the car and I'm in the car. And now I keep thumping my head. Why do I thump my head? Because I don't curl the way I used to. I'm getting older. I'm getting stiffer. In the past, I've had older people pull out in front of me. And why don't you just turn around and look back and see me? Well, now I know. Because, it's not as easy as it used to be. I'm not even 60. It is happening to me like I never expected it. You know it's going to happen one of these days. And if you stop and think about physical life and the time we've got, let's say you reach your prime when you're 18. I think that's a lie. I think you reach your prime when you're about 35. Problem is, with reaching prime at 35, that's about the same time you start going, whoo. and it's not that long before it's over. And we're trying to hold on, not because of vanity necessarily. We're trying to hold on to our health and trying to hold on to living comfortably, trying to not be in pain, trying to look halfway decent so people don't cringe when they see us. Oh, you're gross. And you get to that point where you start to get gross, but God blesses you with poor eyesight, so you don't even see it when you look in the mirror. It's the flesh. And you can't keep the flesh going forever. It's going down. And what God is trying to get us to understand is, I've given you this creation, and I've given you a body of flesh, and I want you to have dominion, but I want you to keep in mind, I'm the ultimate dominator. I can show you how to have dominion in this creation in a way that brings you pleasure and makes me proud. And it's going to fulfill your lives. I can show you how to have relationships with me and with people. I can show you how to do everything else that you need to do in this world if you just come to me. And we say, no, I'll do it myself. And we wind up being silly. Jesus says, the Spirit gives life, the flesh profits nothing. The words that I've spoken to you are spirit and are life. So if Jesus tells us things, they are spirit, but they're not just spirit. What else are they? They're life. And if we listen to Jesus, we're moving towards life. In chapter 8, he said this to those Jews who were believing on him in verse 31. If you continue in my word, what happens? You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Free from what? Free from the bondage of the law, the bondage of sin, the bondage of guilt. That's the kind of bondage he's talking about. And he says, if the Son makes you free, you are free how? Indeed. You are free indeed. I want to be free indeed. The only way to be free indeed is to listen to the words of Jesus. They are spirit, they are life. If I continue in his words, I'm going to know truth. Truth will set us free. I don't want to be in bondage, I want to be free. But if I listen to my flesh, if I follow my flesh, what's going to happen to me? Bondage. Always bondage. The flesh has no capacity to care about truth. The flesh has no capacity to care about what's right. All the flesh knows, all your body knows, is to want what it wants, when it wants it. The flesh has no discipline. You have to discipline your flesh. God has given you a spirit to do that, and you can do that. And as I think about all these things, I wonder, how are any of us going to make it? Because I'm so bad at dominating my flesh. I'm so bad at dominating my pride, my human pride that's connected to this world. The lust of the eyes. I don't have to look at naked girls on TV. I just go to Walmart. Well, that didn't sound right, did it? I mean, I just go to Walmart and I look at the stuff that's hanging on the... That doesn't sound right either, does it? I'm talking about the sporting goods department, okay. Is my face getting red? All right. But that's it. Everywhere we go, it's a struggle, is it not? All some people have to do is call you up on the phone and you answer, oh, it's them again. Oh, great. Well, here's what I'd want to say, but here's what I'm going to say because I know I can't say this because that's not nice, that's not right. I've got to treat this person with love and compassion and understanding, even though they drive me crazy. Even though they make stupid choices in life, and when I try to straighten them out, they won't listen to me. And when that happens to us, say hallelujah, because we're getting a little bit of insight into how it is for God dealing with us. It's marvelous. Every step of the way in life is an opportunity to get a little bit of a picture of how things are for God. You ever stop and think about how much sin God has to see and be aware? We're aware of it because we see the news. We know that the flesh has taken over with a lot of people and they're having no dominion over themselves. They're allowing the world to overcome them, and so they're hating and they're murdering and they're raping and doing all kinds of things because they have no desire to be led by the Spirit of Christ that leads them to life, that leads them to truth, that leads them to freedom. And we struggle with it ourselves. But here's where we'll finish. 1 John chapter 5. And this is kind of a hard lesson to wrap up, but here it is. 1 John chapter 5, look at verse 1. Whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. And whoever loves the Father loves the child born of him. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and observe His commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God overcomes the world. You get that? What's born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. How do we overcome this world? How do we have dominion? How do we beat it? How do we defeat it? Faith. And faith is the victory. It's almost too simple, is it not? But how grateful we should be to God for that marvelous gift. We put our faith in Jesus Christ, whose word is spirit. It brings life. We remain in that word, we learn the truth, and the truth sets us free. And here's our victory, our faith.